Estonia, meanwhile, supports Ukrainian drone strikes on targets in Russia. This was reported by the country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At the same time, they called on Kyiv to exercise caution. The ministry noted this. Vladimir Putin wants the countries over whose territory the drones fly to demand an end to the attacks. But that will not happen. Let's listen.
Russia is deliberately pushing these drones into NATO territory, while simultaneously spreading a fake narrative that NATO, we, the Baltic countries, and Finland are officially allowing Ukraine to use our territory for these attacks. This is not true. We have never allowed this. We would like Ukraine to be more cautious if you are striking at the lifelines of the Russian war machine in Ust-Luga, St. Petersburg, and elsewhere. This is very close to our borders. Putin is deeply concerned because almost 60% of gas and oil exports go through these ports. Therefore, Ukraine must continue. Margus Tsakna, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia.
The Ministry of Defense, together with the General Staff, is launching a new program, a logistical lockdown. This refers to increasing strikes on the nearest Russian rear areas. This was reported by Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov. According to him, the cost of advancing for the Russian army is rising, and the main pattern is the more enemy logistics are destroyed, the fewer assaults take place on the battlefield. Therefore, the task of the Ukrainian military is to increase pressure on the enemy both in the rear and to deprive them of the ability to conduct active offensives. Support for Ukraine will be one of the main topics at the upcoming NATO summit. It will take place in Ankara. A statement from the heads of Ukraine's mission to NATO, in particular Alyona Getmanchuk, confirms this according to her words. There are ongoing complex discussions within the alliance regarding a new model of assistance to Kyiv. In particular, they are discussing Secretary-General Mark Rutte's proposal to allocate 0.25% of the GDP of all member countries to support Ukraine. Let's listen to these words.
We are among the summit's priorities. That is why there is such an active discussion about the distribution of the financial burden among NATO countries. Because let's be honest, it's not a very reasonable situation when, out of all the declared contributions for military aid to Ukraine this year, in fact, just 2 countries will cover almost half of all contributions. Alyona Hetmanchuk, head of Ukraine's mission to NATO.
Dmytro Zhmailo, co-founder and executive director of the Ukrainian Center for Security and Cooperation, is joining us live. Greetings, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Ole. Nice to see you.
Thank you for joining us. Let's probably start with the latest statements from Ms. Hetmanchuk, who talks about a fair distribution and support for Ukraine, rather than the current situation where just a few countries are covering half of the total need. Can such appeals or calls actually influence the state of affairs, or is it, simply a matter of goodwill or lack thereof in each individual capital?
The issue is the lack of goodwill from these countries, the approaches and agreements that were reached during previous negotiation processes, particularly within the framework of the North Atlantic Alliance and the European Union. Here it's more about formalizing these agreements, because despite the fact that there are many summits, many meetings, and many negotiations at various levels, there is still a shortage of funding, and of course Germany and other countries cannot carry all these processes on their own every day. This also concerns in particular the Czech initiative, through which Ukraine receives the lion's share of shells. Recently, the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs communicated that out of the 18 countries that financed it, only 9 remain. Therefore, the issue of the US somewhat stepping back from European policy, let's say, creates room for maneuver for other countries. But firstly, our war is far from over. The United States itself has constantly pressured Europe and called on them to spend more on supporting Ukraine and to invest more in their own defense capabilities. And as the president just said, we definitely have the capability, if such pressure continues and if Russia does not receive external military assistance, to bring about a cessation of hostilities by the end of the year. This is what everyone is striving for and working towards. Therefore, the increased activity and the support of Secretary General Mark Rutte on this issue is yet another way to standardize approaches to supporting Ukraine at war.
Simultaneously looking at the broader picture, how should we accurately calculate and formally declare our needs? Where exactly does this 4% figure come from? Why is it specifically 4 and not perhaps 3 or even 8%?
Because politically that's impossible. We're talking about the fact that our military-industrial complex is currently loaded with 20 billion. It can be scaled up to 55 billion. But we understand that those expenditures and the aid we currently have is actually insufficient. Globally, if you look at the big picture, we are squeezing this aid out of our Western countries, out of our European partners. For example, when the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund amounts to 2.2 trillion, this is because it has increased its capacity precisely due to sanctions on the oil and gas sector, due to our strikes on the oil and gas sector of the Russian Federation. Accordingly, Norwegian hydrocarbons are becoming more in demand on the market. And then, let's look at the aid. Compared to other countries, Norway clearly stands out in terms of the increased amount of funds our state has received. So European countries could do more, they could do much more, but if they are not willing to allocate that much due to a lack of political will, then it simply makes no sense. In general, there is a global question for our partners. How is it that Russia, weakened and exhausted by war with a significant economic decline and a national wealth fund that has been practically depleted by the war, a fund the Russians were once so proud of, which in every respect, including economic strength and human resources, is many times inferior to a united Europe, yet it turns out that we have less money for the war than the Russian Federation, even though we are truly fighting for all of Europe. Last year's provocations showed that Russia will not stop at Ukraine if, God forbid, we collapse. That's why the 0.25% has been discussed for a long time, and it's important that at least this decision goes through, because it's more of an attempt to stabilize and balance the situation. As for political will, that's a very long diplomatic process, but unfortunately these are the facts. Sadly, the comfortable and prosperous lives of Europeans and the fact that the war is happening somewhere far away do not affect government ratings, which have simply plummeted. They justify it by saying they're tired of the war and that it doesn't directly affect them right now, because every increase in military spending means cutting other budget items, and cutting other budget items means losing voters' support, and losing voters' support means the risk of losing their seat. That's precisely why we find ourselves in this situation.
The security situation on the continent, of course, varies from country to country because, first of all, the distance from Russian territory is different, so to speak. But at the same time, I would start this hour with information from the United Kingdom that the Russians are threatening their critical infrastructure. The intelligence services of that country are informing and warning the government about such scenarios. How this security situation on the continent is changing, how it affects support for Ukraine, and in the context of what we have already mentioned, I am talking about the allocation of funds to support Ukrainian armaments and Ukrainian resistance, but also more broadly about this political direction as a whole.
The question, in fact, concerns the activation of these countries. This is exactly what you are talking about, and it was precisely this that Kiss Butler spoke about, emphasizing that we are now entering a period of certain uncertainty, particularly in relations with China and in relations with the Russian Federation. This, in particular, is related to the statement that London has officially imposed a new package of restrictions targeting Russian cryptocurrency and illegal financial platforms used to finance the war. Among those affected are, in particular, legal entities and companies. And it can be said that the flow of $1.5 billion in illegal funds to the Russian Federation has likewise been stopped. As for what the Russians are doing, even 2 years ago, representatives of Western countries emphasized that Russia was preparing for such actions, attacks on critical infrastructure, sabotage, and sabotage against military personnel. In recent years, as you may recall, there have already been incidents such as fires involving Bundeswehr cargo, various provocations, and attempts to blow up depots. In other words, Russia does not stop. And each such statement is merely a way to remind us that this war against Europe, a preparatory war for the active phase of hostilities, is simply ongoing. So, as they say, there is nothing new here. It's just that these new facts of Russia's sabotage and reconnaissance activities are coming to light.
Air defense. This will be discussed, obviously, in terms of strengthening it, including in the Ramstein format. But also, I think you know, recently Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed information about a letter that was sent to at least 2 recipients, Donald Trump as the President of the United States and also the American Congress. In this context, let's talk in more detail about air defense. To what extent are we able to change the situation, for example, by sending such letters or by raising or even making this the central topic in the Ramstein format?
These letters that we are sending are just one of the ways to strengthen it. That is, the effectiveness of our interceptions during the recent massive drone attacks fluctuates between 87 and 95%. Our situation with drones is not bad, but to cover the territory 100%, let them show which air defense system can cover its territory 100% during such a number of aerial threats. In addition, the use of the Oreshnik system. Let me remind you that the Oreshnik is a medium-range strategic ballistic missile, the treaties for which before the full-scale invasion and as a carrier of nuclear weapons were the main focus. It was precisely the non-proliferation of such Oreshniks, medium-range ballistic missiles, in the arsenals of countries. That is why, of course, we need to emphasize this. Because the worst thing Russia does with its strikes, it's not about destroying a garage, of course, in Bila Tserkva. What Russia is doing is accustoming the world to the normalization of striking the territory of countries with such ballistic missiles. And yes, for now, without a nuclear warhead. But the Russians would very much like, of course, to put a nuclear warhead there in order to cause massive destruction. And in this way, we are showing that if this becomes normalized, then in other conflicts, countries that possess such an arsenal of weapons might also resort to this. Accordingly, this is yet another step toward the use of nuclear weapons. And we know that nuclear weapons are only powerful and serve as a significant argument when they are not used, when they are merely considered a threat and a deterrent factor. That is why, of course, we are focusing on this. We are demonstrating our capabilities, and once again, we are reaching out to the world with an outstretched hand. We are ready to provide assistance and to scale up the experience we have shared with the Persian Gulf countries, who are now more successfully defending themselves against Iranian drones. And accordingly, what we need, of course, is funding for further investment in our military-industrial complex and the scarce PAC-3 missiles. Because when it comes to ballistic and aeroballistic missiles, we have the worst indicators, since only the PAC-3 can effectively intercept them. Even with cruise missiles, our situation is much better because we have a whole zoo of old Soviet systems like the S-125, as well as similarly old American Hawk systems that fought back during the Vietnam War. That's why our diplomacy transforms every such attack into new arguments to the world in order to receive more assistance. Every victim, every civilian victim in this war, as well as every military one, must not be in vain.
I have already quoted the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They are talking about Ukrainian drones flying over their territory. First of all, they support Ukrainian drone strikes on targets in Russia. At the same time, they are calling on Kyiv to exercise caution. Well, this is not the first such appeal. And this is not the first capital from which such an appeal to Kyiv has been made. But how should we regard this? Is this more of a protocol matter where everyone seems to understand everything, but diplomatically it is necessary to respond? Or is it, after all, something more serious?
On the contrary, I viewed the statement by the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs very positively, precisely because they clearly understand what is happening. For the viewers, it might be worth repeating that Ukrainian drones, in fact, do not fly through the territory of the Baltic countries. They fly through the territory of the Russian Federation, and the Russians have specifically deployed electronic warfare systems near the border that, so to speak, knock the drones off course, thereby intentionally transferring our drones and redirecting them onto the territory of the North Atlantic Alliance. So this whole story in general, the logic is that when we attack the area of St. Petersburg, when we target the Karelian military district, when we strike at their infrastructure, and this statement, on the contrary, shows an understanding of why this is happening. And under no circumstances should Ukraine stop these strikes, because the Baltic countries understand that this is one of the ways to force Russia to make peace. If this pressure does not happen, then the Baltic countries will be next. And this greatly contrasts with the statements of Polish high-ranking officials, because they are shifting the responsibility specifically onto Ukraine, not onto Russia, which is actually doing this, but onto Ukraine, telling it to be more cautious and so on. It's easier for Ukraine to act this way, rather than think about strengthening its air defense or about the possible deployment of additional Polish troops within NATO to protect this border. Well, let's put it bluntly, sorry for the harshness, it's easier to pressure Ukraine. That's why I think this statement was important in the context of this process, because after all, these statements by European and high-ranking Polish officials were supported by the Russians, who launched corresponding information and psychological operations. Therefore, once again, I want to emphasize that we have an understanding with the Baltic countries, and our diplomacy is working precisely in this direction to provide the right assessment of these events that are taking place. That these are, in fact, attacks by the Russians, who are using Ukrainian weapons seized during the fighting.
Well, by the way, this also absolutely follows from the statement I quoted, referring to the head of Estonia's foreign ministry. Thank you for the conversation. Dmytro Zhmylo, co-founder and executive director of the Ukrainian Center for Security and Cooperation, was just live with us.